The world didn't end all at once. It just got very dark and very quiet. 2 months ago, something hit the upper atmosphere, an asteroid fragment or a stray lunar chunk, and kicked up enough sulfur and pulverized crust to wrap the Earth in a thick, suffocating blanket of particulate matter. Now, we live in the impact winter, though I've taken to calling it the eternal twilight. The Earth still spins, but the sun is a ghost. Daylight is nothing more than a bruised, violet haze that struggles to penetrate the soot for maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. When that dim purple glow finally retreats, it is replaced by a 14-hour stretch of night so absolute and ink black that the world effectively ceases to exist beyond the reach of a flashlight beam. I was currently stranded on the Blackwood Bridge, a massive concrete and steel span that arched over a dry, ash-choked riverbed. It felt like a tombstone in the twilight. My truck, a heavy-duty electric pickup, was currently nothing more than a 2.5-ton paperweight. I'd spent years converting this rig for total off-grid independence, long before the sky broke. I had stripped out the unnecessary infotainment junk and beefed up the suspension with heavy-duty leaf springs to handle the weight of the truck camper I'd bolted into the bed. The camper was a rugged, hard-sided unit designed for four-season survival. It wasn't one of those flimsy shells you see at a weekend campsite. It was a self-contained fortress. It featured a small kitchenette with an induction cooktop, a compact wet bath, and a cab-over sleeping area where the dogs and I huddled for warmth. On the floorboards of the truck, I had a custom 120 kilowatt-hour lithium iron phosphate battery bank. In the old world, it could push this truck 300 miles on a single charge. But I had banked on the sun. The 800 watts of monocrystalline solar panels mounted to the camper's roof were designed for high-efficiency absorption, but they were never meant to operate in a world where the light was filtered through a layer of volcanic ash and sulfur. My battery monitor was currently glowing a faint, mocking red, pulsing at 1%. That was just enough juice to keep the door locks from seizing and the digital dash clock frozen at 12 o'clock. The silence on the bridge was a physical weight, broken only by the low, morning whistle of the wind through the steel girders below. It was a constant, biting wind, the kind that finds every microscopic gap in a seal and drains the heat from the camper's insulated walls in minutes. I sat on the edge of the small dinette, staring at my hands. They were cracked from the cold, the skin stained with the fine, gray soot that seemed to permeate everything. My breath puffed out in small, rhythmic ghosts of vapor. I reached out and tapped the glass of the battery monitor, hoping for a miracle, but the 1% stayed steady, a death sentence in digital numbers. "Come on, boys," I whispered, my voice sounding raspy and thin in the cramped space. "Time to move while the sky is still purple." Bear, my Great Pyrenees mix, shifted first. He was 100 pounds of thick white fur that acted like a natural beacon in the dim light. He hopped down from a cab-over bed, his joints clicking on the vinyl flooring, and waited by the camper door with a stoic patience. Echo, my German shepherd, was already on her feet. Her ears were constantly swiveling, tracking the groans of the bridge and the distant, unsettling settling of the earth. I didn't leave them behind. In a world that had gone cold and silent, they were the only heartbeats that mattered, the only things keeping me from becoming just another ghost in the ash. I slid the heavy camper door open and was immediately hit by the air. It didn't smell like winter. It tasted like wet ash, burnt rubber, and old pennies. I stepped down onto the cracked asphalt of the bridge, my boots crunching on a fine layer of gray grit. I reached back into the camper and grabbed my rucksack and a heavy 30-inch forged steel crowbar. The hike toward the north end of the bridge was a lesson in humility. The wind pushed against us, a relentless force that made every step a struggle. To my left, the rusted remains of a 2018 sedan sat abandoned, its tires flat and its interior filled with drifted ash. It was a reminder of the old world, A world of gas stations and traffic jams that was now as dead as the prehistoric creatures the fuel was made from. I glanced into the driver's side window as I passed. A thick layer covered the dashboard, and a faded air freshener hung still from the rearview mirror. It felt like walking through a museum of things that no longer mattered. We reached the edge of the commercial strip. The windows of the first few shops, a cell phone store and a dry cleaner, had been blown out long ago. Glass shards crunched under my boots like frozen needles. I bypassed the obvious targets. The big box stores had been picked clean in the first 72 hours of the panic. People tend to swarm the familiar places, leaving the niche shops alone. I kept my head down, avoiding the open areas of the parking lots where the wind whipped the ash into blinding miniature cyclones. I led the dogs into a small, independent grocery store tucked between a pharmacy and a laundromat. The interior was a cavern of shadows. I clicked on my headlamp, keeping the beam on its lowest setting. I didn't want a bright white light announcing my presence to anyone watching from the hills. The shelves were mostly skeletal remains of cardboard and plastic. I moved to the back, toward the manager's office, hoping to find a hidden stash. Under a collapsed display of seasonal greeting cards, I spotted a flicker of blue plastic. I reached down and pulled out 3 dusty cans of black beans and a nearly full jar of industrial-sized peanut butter. It wasn't a feast, but it was high-calorie fuel. I stuffed them into the rucksack, the weight of the cans a welcome burden against my spine. I checked the expiration dates by the faint glow of my headlamp, 2027. They would taste like tin and preservative, but they were life. "Good eye, Echo," I said, patting her flank. She didn't wag her tail. She just looked toward the door, her body tense. She could hear things I couldn't. The shifting of metal in the wind, the scuttle of something in the rafters. As I turned to leave, my light swept across the shattered front window of the laundromat next door. I stopped. My mind went back to a series of technical forums I used to haunt, prepper boards and DIY EV groups. We'd talked about the direct drive solution. I walked into the laundromat. It smelled of stagnant water, mildew, and cheap lavender detergent. There, bolted to the floor in a neat row, with a high-efficiency front-loading washing machines. Most people looked at these and saw a way to clean clothes. I saw a solution to my 1% battery problem. I knelt behind the third machine in the row and began to tear at the back panel with the crowbar. The metal groaned and screamed, the sound echoing off the tile walls like a gunshot. I winced at the noise but didn't stop. I was focused on the prize, the pancake motor. In these high-end models, the motor isn't a traditional induction type. It's a permanent magnet brushless motor. It's basically a heavy ring of powerful neodymium magnets that sits around a stator of copper windings. In its normal life, electricity goes in and spins a drum. But physics works both ways. If you spin that drum manually, those magnets move past copper coils and push electrons. It becomes a permanent magnet generator, a robust, weather-resistant power plant that can produce significant voltage even at low RPMs. I worked with feverish intensity, my fingers numbing in the biting cold. I unscrewed the mounting bolts, my knuckles bleeding as a wrench slipped in the dim light. I had to be careful not to damage the Hall effect sensors or the wiring harness, though I knew I'd have to bypass the internal controller anyway. I used the crowbar to pry the rotor hub off the shaft, the magnets fighting me with every inch of travel. They wanted to stay put, clinging to the stator with a magnetic force that was both impressive and frustrating. After 40 minutes of straining, the motor finally came free with a heavy metallic clunk. It was heavy, maybe 45 pounds of pure copper, and magnets. It felt like a solid anchor, a piece of the old world that I could twist into a tool for the new one. I ran my fingers over the copper windings, feeling the intricate pattern. It was beautiful in its utility. "This is it." I breathed, resting the motor on the floor. This is how we get off the bridge. The violet light outside was deepening. The day was ending. The purple was bleeding into a dark, bruised indigo, signaling the approach of the absolute night. If we didn't get back to the bridge soon, we'd be navigating a maze of debris and shattered glass in total darkness. I checked my watch. We had maybe 20 minutes of usable twilight left. I hauled the motor into my rucksack, the weight lopsided and awkward. I shouldered the pack, feeling the straps dig deep into my collarbones, threatening to bruise a muscle. The dog sensed the urgency. Bear leaned against my leg for a second, a silent offer of support, before turning back toward the street. The trek back was grueling. The 40-pound motor shifted with every step, the sharp edges of the stator housing pressing into my lower back to the padding of the pack. My legs were burning, the muscles cramped from the cold and the uneven terrain. I had to stop every 100 yards to catch my breath, my lungs aching as they sucked in the ash-thickened air. Each breath felt like sandpaper. The bridge seemed to stretch out into the gloom, an infinite path of gray concrete that refused to end. I could see the silhouette of the truck in the distance, a dark shape against the violet horizon, but it felt miles away. The wind had picked up, howling between the buildings with a renewed ferocity. It bit at my face and chilled the sweat on my back, turning it to ice. I tucked my chin into my collar, focusing on the rhythmic click-clack of Echo's nails on the pavement. But as I looked up at the darkening sky, I didn't feel the same dread I had earlier. I felt the weight of the copper in my pack, and then looked back toward the bridge where the wind never stopped blowing. The solar panels were dead, but the wind was alive. It was kinetic energy just waiting to be harvested. I just needed to build the net. I thought about the bridge's height, how the wind tunneled through the valley, gaining speed as it compressed under the spans. It was a perfect wind tunnel. I had the generator. I just needed the blades. We reached the bridge just as the last of the purple light vanished entirely. The world went black. Not the black of a dark room, but the oppressive, heavy black of an abyss. I felt my way along the side of the truck, my hands sliding over the cold, matte finish of the camper shell until I found the latch. My fingers were so numb I could barely operate the handle, but finally, it clicked. Inside, I set the motor down on the floorboards with a heavy thud that vibrated through the truck's frame. The dogs scrambled into their corner, curling into a tight ball of fur to conserve every bit of body heat. I sat on the edge of the small bench, my breath blooming in a thick cloud in the beam of my headlamp. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, haggard, soot-stained, but alive. I pulled a heavy wool blanket over my shoulders and stared at the motor. In the silence of the black night, I began to plan. I needed to carve blades out of something lightweight, but rigid. I had the plastic traction board strapped to the side of the truck, Max-Trax clones. They were glass-reinforced nylon. If I cut them right, they'd make perfect turbine blades. I had the food. I had the copper. Now, I just had to survive the 14-hour night long enough to build our way out of this grave. I leaned my head back against the camper wall, listening to the wind scream against the roof, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The wind wasn't my enemy anymore. It was my fuel. The night on the Blackwood Bridge was an exercise in sensory deprivation. Inside the truck camper, the darkness was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against the windows. I sat on the edge of the narrow bench. The beam of my headlamp narrowed down to a tiny, power-saving sliver of light. Outside, the wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It buffeted the sides of the camper, rocking the entire 2.5-ton rig on its suspension. In the old world, that sound would have kept me awake with anxiety. Now, it was a sound of opportunity, the roar of a fuel source I had finally learned how to tap. "Easy, Bear," I muttered as the Great Pyrenees let out a low, vibrating growl. The bridge was groaning under the thermal contraction of the deep freeze, sending sharp, metallic cracks echoing through the chassis like distant rifle fire. Echo was perched near the floor, her chin resting on my boot, her ears twitching with every shift of the wind. They knew the stakes. If I couldn't get the heater back online, the temperature inside would drop below freezing by morning, and our journey would end before it truly began. I reached down and hauled the washing machine motor onto the small dinette table. In the cramped, freezing space, it looked like a prehistoric artifact, a heavy, circular hunk of steel and copper. I pulled my toolkit from the cabinet under the sink. It was a modest collection, a set of hex keys, a soldering iron that I'd have to heat over the propane stove, a multimeter, and a hacksaw. The first step was the most delicate. I had to strip the motor down to its core components. These direct drive units were built to last decades, which meant they were a nightmare to disassemble without a powered impact wrench. I spent the first 2 hours of the black night hunched over the table, my breath blooming in the light of the headlamp like thick, white smoke. I carefully removed the rotor, the outer ring lined with powerful neodymium magnets. These magnets were so strong they snapped my screwdriver out of my hand if I got too close, a reminder of the raw, chaotic energy waiting to be harnessed. I was deep into the wiring, my eyes straining to differentiate the 3 phases of the motor, when Bear nudged my elbow. He didn't just nudge it. He shoved his massive, cold nose right into my funny bone. I let out a sharp hiss of air as my hand slipped. "Not now, Bear," I whispered, but Bear was persistent. He moved to the door and gave a sharp, distinctive whine. Then Echo joined him, her tail thumping once against the camper wall. They needed out. Even in a world that had gone to hell, the basic biological needs of 200 pounds of dog didn't stop. I looked at the copper guts of the motor scattered across the table, and then at the door. The temperature outside was likely 10 below zero with the wind chill, and the darkness was absolute. I sighed, setting the wire strippers down. Fine. Quick trip. Getting ready was a ritual. I couldn't just step out. The cold would sap my core temperature in minutes. I pulled on my heavy wool base layers, then my insulated bibs. I donned a fleece-lined face mask and pulled my goggles down over my eyes to protect them from the stinging ash that the wind carried. I clipped Bear and Echo's leashes to their harnesses, checking the carabiners by touch. I grabbed my powerful searchlight, the one with a high-output lithium battery I'd been saving for emergencies. I cracked the door, and the wind immediately tried to kick its way inside. It took my full weight to ease it open just enough for the dogs to scramble out. I followed them, the door slamming shut behind me with a violent bang. The bridge was a nightmare of shadows. I clicked on the searchlight, the beam cutting a narrow white tunnel through the swirling gray particulate. It looked like we were standing on a pier in the middle of a dark, frozen ocean. Bear and Echo didn't waste time. They knew the routine. They stayed close to the side of the truck, using the camper as a windbreak. I watched them, my boots planted firmly on the grit-covered concrete. Even through my heavy gloves, my fingers were beginning to ache. I swept the light across the bridge. The abandoned cars looked like jagged teeth rising from the asphalt. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of ash, a gray shroud that erased all color. I found myself staring into the abyss beyond the bridge railing. Somewhere down there was a dry riverbed, but in this light, it was just a void. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of vertigo and pulled my gaze back to the dogs. "Hurry up, guys," I urged, my voice muffled by the face mask. Once they were finished, we scrambled back toward the warmth of the camper. Opening the door was even harder from the outside. I had to brace my feet against the bridge's expansion joint and pull with everything I had. We tumbled inside, the dogs shaking the freezing dust in their coats, while I leaned against the door, panting. It took 10 minutes just to strip the layers back off and get my hands warm enough to hold a tool again. I returned to the stator, wiping away years of lint and stagnant water from the copper coils with a rag dampened with a bit of isopropyl alcohol. My goal was to wire the coils in a way that would produce the highest voltage at the lowest possible RPM. The wind out there was fast, but I didn't have the luxury of a gearbox to step up the speed. I had to rely on the inherent physics of the magnets passing the copper. I began the tedious process of rerouting the wiring. I had to identify the 3 phases of the motor, stripping the hair-thin wires with a pair of side cutters and my fingernails. My hands were shaking from the cold, making the soldering process a nightmare. I had to light the propane stove, the last of my gas, just to heat the iron. Every blue flame felt like a waste, but without it, I couldn't bridge the connection to the rectifier. I soldered the leads directly to a 3-phase bridge rectifier I'd pulled from my spare parts bin. This device was the heart of the operation. It would take the wild, alternating current produced by the spinning motor and flatten it into the steady direct current my truck's lithium batteries could accept. Halfway there, I whispered to the dogs. Bear huffed, a cloud of white vapor hitting my leg. He looked up at me with those deep, soulful eyes, and for a second, I felt the crushing weight of the responsibility. If I failed this, I wasn't just failing myself. I was failing them. By the 4th hour of the night, the interior of the camper had dropped to 38 degrees. I could see the frost beginning to crystallize on the screw heads of the window frames, turning them into tiny white stars. I couldn't wait for the purple light to start the heavy work. I needed the blades, and I needed them now. I bundled back into my parka, pulled on my grit-stained gloves, and stepped out into the abyss once more. The wind nearly ripped the door from my hand, the pressure differential sucking the air out of the camper. I clicked my headlamp to full power, the beam cutting a weak, flickering path through the swirling gray ash. I moved to the side of the truck, where my Max-Trax traction boards were mounted. These were heavy-duty plastic planks designed to be shoved under tires in mud or sand. They were made of glass-reinforced nylon, incredibly tough, slightly flexible and weather-resistant. I unbolted the pair, my frozen fingers fumbling with the wingnets, and dragged them back inside the camper. The dogs watched with mild confusion as I cleared the floor space. Using a grease pencil, I traced the outline of 3 aerodynamic blades onto the plastic. I wasn't an aeronautical engineer, but I'd spent enough time around wind farms to understand the basic twist required to catch the air. I needed a high start torque, which meant the blades had to be wide at the base and narrow at the tips. Then came the noise. I started the hacksaw, the blade biting into the tough, glass-filled nylon. The sound was a rhythmic, agonizing screech that filled the small cabin, vibrating through my teeth. I worked until my forearms burned and my shoulders cramped into knots. Each blade took 40 minutes of constant, punishing sawing. I had to be precise. If the blades weren't balanced, if one was even a few grams heavier than the others, the vibration at high speed would tear the generator off the roof before it could even finish a single revolution. By the time the 3rd blade was cut, my hands were raw and shaking from the effort. I spent another hour sanding the edges smooth with a hand file, shaping the leading edges to bite into the wind and the trailing edges to let it slip away. I used the center hub from the washing machine's drum, the same part that used to hold the laundry, to mount the blades. It was a perfect heavy-duty flange. I drilled holes through the tough nylon using a hand crank drill, my muscles screaming with every turn. Finally, I bolted the nylon blades to the hub, creating a crude but formidable 3-bladed turbine nearly 4 feet in diameter. The final hurdle was the mounting, and this was the part that terrified me. I couldn't just stick this on a pole. The torque from the wind on the bridge would be immense. I had to use the truck's heavy-duty ladder rack. I spent the final hours of the night, the coldest, darkest hours, climbing onto the roof of the camper. The wind was so fierce I had to tether myself to the rack with a climbing rope to keep from being blown off the bridge into the black void below. In the dark, with only the pinpoint of my headlamp, I lashed the generator to the highest point of the rack. I used heavy-duty U-bolts and several lengths of steel cable to guide it down, creating a tripod of tension. My fingers were so numb, I could no longer feel the nuts I was tightening, relying entirely on the muscle memory of the wrench and the sound of the metal biting into metal. I ran the heavy-gauge copper wire from the motor down to the refrigerator vent, feeding it directly into the truck's power distribution block. I was working by touch now, my headlamp battery finally beginning to fade. I climbed back down, shivering so violently my teeth were literally chattering, and stumbled into the camper. Bear and Echo were waiting at the door, sensing the shift in my energy. I reached for the battery monitor. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I flipped the master switch. Outside, the turbine groaned as the wind caught the new blades. There was a low, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum that vibrated through the entire camper shell, a deep bass note that felt like the bridge itself was breathing. On the wall, the digital display flickered. The red low battery light stayed on, but the voltage reading, which had been a steady 11.2 volts, began to climb. 11.5, 11.9, 12.4. Then, the charging icon appeared. A tiny, glowing bolt of lightning in a sea of darkness. It was only pulling about 400 watts, a trickle compared to the massive capacity of the truck's bank. But it was enough. It was more than enough. I slumped onto the floor between the two dogs, my back against the vibrating wall of the camper. The heater clicked on, a faint whir of fan followed by the glorious, heavenly scent of burning diesel from the auxiliary heater. The air coming out of the vent was lukewarm at first, then hot, filling the small space with life-saving warmth. I looked at my hands. They were covered in grease, blood, and nylon dust. They were the hands of a man who refused to die on a bridge. "We're not staying here, boys," I said, burying my face in Bear's thick neck. The dog leaned into me, his warmth radiating through my jacket, his tail giving a single, heavy thump against the floor. "We're getting off this bridge, and we're going to find a way to grow something in this dark." As the first faint, bruised violet of eternal twilight began to bleed into the eastern horizon, I didn't see a bleak landscape. I saw a road map. The battery monitor now read 4%. In an electric truck, 4% was roughly 10 miles of range if I drove like a saint. 10 miles was enough to get us off this concrete graveyard, away from the exposed height of the bridge, and toward the tree line where the real work of building the greenhouse could begin. The vibration of the turbine above was a new heartbeat for the rig. It was a constant, mechanical reminder that as long as the world stayed cold and the wind kept howling, I had a way to fight back. I closed my eyes for 30 minutes of hard-earned sleep. The sound of the charging batteries, singing a lullaby of copper and magnets, while the purple dawn slowly reclaimed the world. The vibration of the wind turbine was a constant, low-frequency hum that resonated through the aluminum frame of the camper, a mechanical heartbeat that told me we were still in the fight. By the time the violet haze of eternal twilight finally settled over Blackwood Bridge, the battery monitor had crept up to a solid 7%. In the world of high-performance electric motors, 7% was a fortune, but it was a deceptive one. It was enough to prime the thermal management system for the battery packs, circulating warm coolant so the lithium cells wouldn't crack under the load, clear the high-voltage contactors, and give me about 15 miles of cautious, low-speed travel. "Time to earn your keep, truck," I muttered, sliding into the driver's seat. The cabin was a cockpit of shadows. I didn't dare turn on the main 15-inch infotainment touchscreen. In a world where every what was a second life, that screen was a parasitic vampire. I relied on the small, secondary analog-style gauges I'd hardwired into the dash during the conversion. I pressed the start button. There was no roar of an engine, no vibration of pistons. Instead, There was a faint, high-pitched click-clink as the heavy-duty contactors closed under the floorboards, mating the 800-volt battery bank to the dual motors. A soft, electronic hum vibrated through the steering wheel. The truck groaned as I eased it into drive. The brake rotors had developed a thin layer of flash rust and grit from the salt-heavy air, and they shrieked, a high-pitched, metallic scream that felt loud enough to wake the dead. I winced, easing off the pedal until the truck began to roll. Bear and Echo were braced in the back of the cab. Bear's massive paws were planted on the heavy-duty rubber floor mats, while Echo sat upright, her head swiveling between the side windows. I navigated to the graveyard of abandoned cars on the bridge, the electric motors providing instantaneous, silent torque. This was the one advantage of the EV in the apocalypse. I could weave the narrow gaps between rusted sedans and jackknifed semis, while the rhythmic throb of a diesel engine announcing my presence. We reached the end of the concrete span and transitioned onto the cracked remains of Highway 42. This was where the gray zone started, a stretch of lowlands where the ash settled in thick, waist-deep drifts. The world here wasn't purple. It was a monochromatic smear of charcoal and slate. The silence of the electric drive became a tactical necessity as we descended into the valley. As the elevation dropped, the sound of the wind turbine above changed. The air was denser here, less turbulent than the high-altitude gusts of the bridge, and the turbine slowed from a scream to a steady, rhythmic thrum. 2 miles into the valley, the world felt too quiet. I was traveling at a steady 15 miles per hour, my eyes straining to pick out the edge of the asphalt through the violet gloom. Suddenly, Echo's head snapped toward the passenger window. Her hackles went up, and she let out a low, breathy woof that didn't break the silence so much as it bruised it. I immediately let off the accelerator, the regenerated braking slowing the truck with a faint, ghostly whine. I looked out into the purple gloom. At first, I saw nothing but the skeletal remains of a pine forest, the trees stripped of their needles and coated in gray so like some macabre art installation. Then I saw it, a flicker of orange, unnatural light tucked into the lee of a collapsed highway overpass. And then came the sound. It was a rhythmic mechanical chugging, the uneven heavy metal heartbeat of an internal combustion engine with a bad manifold. I immediately killed my DRL's daytime running lights, plunging the cabin into the bruised violet darkness. I shifted the truck into its creep mode, a software setting I had written to limit the current to the motors to almost nothing, minimizing the electromagnetic whine of the inverters. Stay quiet, I whispered. My heart was thumping against my ribs. As we rolled past the overpass at a snail's pace, the scene came into focus. These weren't refugees or families trying to find a warm basement. These were gas guzzlers. I could see 3 heavy-duty trucks, old 12-valve diesels by the sound of them, idling in a semicircle to create a wall against the wind. They were armored with welded rebar, expanded metal grates over the windows, and scrap-plate steel bolted to the doors. A group of 6 men in mismatched winter gear, heavy Carhartts and tactical vests, were huddled around a barrel fire, passing a plastic jug. One of them was hunched over the fuel tank of a stranded minivan, working a manual siphon hose with rhythmic, practiced movements. They were loud, their laughter cutting to the cold air with a jagged edge. In a world where gasoline was a finite, rotting resource, these men were a dying breed, which made them twice as dangerous. They were the scavengers who didn't know how to build or adapt. They only knew how to take. The wind shifted, blowing from the overpass directly toward the truck. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the gear selector. If the scent of the dogs carried, or if one of those men had a pair of working night vision goggles, we were done. One of the scavengers, a man in a grease-stained parka, looked up. He squinted into the violet haze, holding a rusted AK-style rifle loosely in the crook of his arm. I watched him through the side view mirror, my pulse thundering in my ears. If he raised that rifle, I'd have to floor it, dumping my precious 7% into a high-speed escape that would leave us stranded 5 miles down the road in the middle of nowhere. He spat a dark glob into the ash, kicked a piece of wood into the fire, and turned back to his group. We slipped past like a ghost, the silent rotation of my tires on the ash-covered road making less noise in the wind. Once we were a mile past the overpass, I allowed myself to exhale. The tension in my shoulders was so tight it felt like the muscles were made of wire. Too close. I rasped, reaching over to pat Bear's head. He didn't relax. He stayed focused on the rear window until the orange glow of the fire vanished entirely. The encounter reinforced everything. I couldn't stay on the main roads, and I couldn't rely on being a ghost forever. I needed the Arkansas. An hour later, we reached the Oak Haven commercial greenhouses. Before the impact, this place had supplied the county with organic kale and bedding flowers. Now, it was a massive complex of glass and steel skeletons, most of the panes shattered by the initial impact tremors or the weight of the falling ash. But the structural bones, the heavy-duty aluminum framing, were still there, rooted in the frozen earth. I pulled the truck around to the loading bay of the largest unit, Unit 4. The battery was sitting at 5% now. I needed to move fast. The daylight was already beginning to fade from violet into a deep, bruised indigo. I didn't just want seeds or soil. I needed a platform. I found in the back of the maintenance shed a 20-foot dual-axle utility trailer with a heavy-duty steel frame. It was designed for hauling bobcats and commercial mowers, meaning it could handle the weight of what I had planned. Using the truck's remaining battery juice, I backed the hitch up to the trailer. The backup camera was grainy and gray, but I lined it up. Thud. The ball hit the coupler. I jumped out, my boots sinking into 6 inches of fine, silty ash, and cranked the jack until the trailer was secure. My lungs burned. The air here was thicker than on the bridge, filled with the smell of stagnant fertilizer and rot. I spent the next 2 hours, the final, desperate minutes of the twilight, scavenging. I didn't just take the first things I saw. I went into the retail section and smashed the locks on the high-end supplies. I found rolls of high-grade mylar, the stuff used in grow tents, which would be essential for reflecting every single lumen of light back onto the plants. I found stacks of full-spectrum LED grow lights, their drivers tucked into weather-resistant boxes. But the most important find was the polycarbonate. Unlike the glass that had shattered, the polycarbonate panels were flexible and impact-resistant. I began unscrewing them from the one intact greenhouse section, my fingers numbing as I worked a cordless drill. I loaded 10 of the massive 4x8 sheets onto the trailer deck, securing them with ratchet straps. These would be the walls of the Ark, a mobile insulated greenhouse that I could hitch to the truck and tow into the mountains. I found several spools of 12-gauge copper wire and a pallet of living soil bags, peat and perlite mixes that hadn't been poisoned by the ashfall yet. I hauled them one by one onto the trailer, my back screaming with the effort. Every movement was a race against the light. As the purple sky finally surrendered to the absolute, terrifying black of the 14-hour night, I was drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. The trailer was loaded, a jagged silhouette of scavenged hope hitched to the back of my silent rig. I climbed back into the cab, my muscles trembling so hard I could barely grip the wheel. The battery monitor was at 2% now, the red zone. I looked up through the sunroof at the wind turbine. In the pitch black, I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The valley winds were funneling through the greenhouse structures, catching the nylon blades and sending a steady, low-frequency vibration through the chassis. "We have the components," I said to Echo, who was watching the dark woods with narrowed eyes. "Now we just have to build a world that doesn't need the sun." I sat there in the dark, the auxiliary heater blowing a faint, lukewarm stream of air and began to sketch the wiring diagram for the trailer in my head. I'd need to lace the polycarbonate walls with heating tape and line the interior with the mylar. I'd have to tap into the truck's main high-voltage pack through a step-down transformer to power the LEDs. It was a complex, dangerous engineering puzzle. But as the wind howled and the turbine thrummed above me, I felt a strange, cold clarity. The gas guzzlers were out there, fighting over the last drops of a dead world. Me? I was building a new one wood at a time, in the back of an electric truck. I closed my eyes, listening to the dogs breathe, and waited for the wind to give me enough juice to move again. The 14th hour of the night was always the hardest. It was a dead zone, that stretch of time where the cold finally won the battle against the truck's insulation, and the psychological weight of the absolute blackness outside felt heavy enough to crush the roof in. I sat in the driver's seat, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and a heavy down quilt, watching the battery monitor like a hawk. The wind turbine was screaming now. A massive weather front was moving through the valley, pushing air at a steady 40 miles per hour. The truck rocked violently on its springs, the suspension squeaking with every gust. But the display was doing something beautiful. It was showing a steady 2.5 kilowatt intake. By the time the first agonizingly slow bleed of violet light touched the horizon, I had 18% in the pack. It was a miracle of copper and magnets. I didn't waste a second of that purple twilight. I climbed out into the ash, my boots sinking deep into the gray soot that had drifted against the tires, and began the brutal work of transforming the utility trailer into the Ark. The transformation was an engineering nightmare. I needed the trailer to be more than just a hauling deck. It had to be a sealed, thermal-regulated environment capable of tricking biology into thinking it was a summer afternoon in the middle of a volcanic winter. I started by laying down the polycarbonate panels I'd scavenged, using self-tapping screws and a handheld manual driver, saving the power drill's battery for only the toughest bits. I began to erect a low-profile, slanted roof structure on the trailer bed. It looked like a translucent coffin at first, a long, narrow box of plastic that hummed whenever the wind caught it. The cold made every movement a trial. Every time I had to pick up a screw, I had to peel my glove back, exposing my skin to the biting air for just a few seconds before the numbness set in. The polycarbonate was brittle, clicking and popping under the pressure of the fasteners. I had to pre-drill every hole by hand using a small gimlet, a process that made the muscles in my forearms burn with a dull, throbbing ache. I worked with frantic, rhythmic intensity, driven by the knowledge that this twilight was the only day I would get. Inside that box, I lined every square inch with the mylar. The silver material crinkled and roared in the wind like 1,000 tiny thunderstorms, but once it was taped down with heavy-duty foil tape, the interior of the trailer transformed into a mirror-bright chamber. This was the key to the whole operation. In a world without sun, every single photon produced by the LEDs had to be reflected, bounced, and recycled back onto the soil. I was building a light trap, a jewel of radiation in a world of absorption. The mylar was a nightmare to handle. The static electricity from the dry air made it cling to my clothes, my hair, and itself. I spent 20 minutes just fighting one corner that refused to stay flat, my breath hitching in the thin air as I wrestled the metallic sheet into submission. Once the lining was in place, I began the task of installing the grow trays. These were salvage industrial units, heavy black plastic filled with a proprietary mix of peat, perlite, and slow-release nutrients I'd found in the greenhouse's back storage room. I had to lift them one by one onto the trailer deck, my back screaming with the effort. Each tray weighed 50 pounds, and the footing in the deep ash was treacherous. I slipped once, my knee slamming into the steel frame of the trailer, and for a moment, the world went white with pain. I stayed there, slumped against the wheel, gasping for air that tasted like burnt matches, until throbbing in my legs subsided enough to keep going. I spent the next 3 hours of the twilight wiring the internal grid. I had to be meticulous. I took the 12-gauge copper wire and ran a main bus along the ceiling of the trailer, tapping into it to mount the full-spectrum LED bars. These weren't the cheap purple lights from the old world. These were high-output, industrial-grade arrays. I used a small butane soldering iron to fuse the connections. The tiny blue flame the only heat in the world for a 5-inch radius. The smell of burning rosin was strangely comforting, a scent from a world where electronics were a hobby, not a survival requirement. But as I was stripping the insulation off the main feed, a sudden, violent gust of wind caught a loose polycarbonate panel I hadn't secured yet. It acted like a sail, wrenching the screw holes out and nearly taking my thumb with it. I swore, the sound swallowed instantly by the gale. I had to drop everything, wrestling the 4x8 sheet of plastic as it whipped back and forth, threatening to shatter against the truck's frame. My fingers, already numb and bleeding from the sharp edges of the mylar, struggled to grip the slick surface. I had to lay my entire body weight across the panel, pinning it to the trailer deck while I fumbled for my manual screwdriver. "Helpful, aren't you?" I grunted at the wind. Once the panel was finally pinned, I realized the dogs were gone. Or rather, they weren't where I'd left them. "Bear! Echo!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the roar of the mountains. I scanned the perimeter with my headlamp, the beam cutting through the swirling ash. I found them 50 yards away, near the edge of the greenhouse's old irrigation pond. Echo was in a full point, her tail straight and her ears pinned forward. Bear was standing slightly in front of her, his hackles raised so high he looked like a prehistoric beast. I moved toward them, my heart climbing into my throat, my hand reaching for the heavy wrench at my belt. In the dim purple light, I saw the tracks. They weren't human. They were deep, heavy imprints in the ash, paw prints the size of dinner plates. A mountain lion, driven down from the high peaks by the same hunger that was killing everything else. It had been circling the greenhouse while I was busy with the wiring, a silent, starving ghost watching my every move. The realization sent a cold shiver through me that had nothing to do with the wind. I was so focused on the gas guzzlers and the batteries that I'd forgotten the world was still wild, and the wild was getting very, very hungry. I whistled the dogs back, not wanting them to chase a desperate predator into the dark ruins. We retreated to the truck, where I finished the umbilical connection with one eye on the shadows. I had to connect the trailer's power grid to the truck's massive battery pack, crawling under the rear bumper with my face inches from the ash-covered differential. I spliced a heavy-duty high-voltage cable into the truck's auxiliary power takeoff, tightening the lugs until my wrists ached. The cable was thick and stubborn, resisting the cold, but I forced it into the terminal blocks, sealing the junction with a generous layer of silicone to keep the moisture out. "Ready, Echo?" I asked as we climbed back into the cab. She let out a short, sharp bark, her eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Then came the real threat. Echo's bark wasn't for me. It was a warning. She could hear something, a distant, low thrum that wasn't the wind and wasn't a mountain lion. It was a rhythmic, metallic clatter of a diesel engine. I grabbed my binoculars and peered to the violet haze toward the ridge line 1/2 mile away. 2 trucks, the same armored rigs from the overpass, were scouting the area. Their spotlights were powerful, cutting through the purple gloom like the eyes of some angry god. They were moving in a grid, and they were headed straight for the greenhouse. They were hunting for the source of the wind turbine's noise, or maybe they'd seen the faint reflection of my headlamp. "Go, go, go," I hissed. I didn't turn on the lights. I relied on the truck's thermal imaging camera. The screen showed the world in ghost map blues, but the gas guzzler's engines were bright orange flares on the horizon. I eased the truck forward, the heavy trailer behind me tugging at the hitch. The silent motors groaned under the weight of the polycarbonate, the 300 pounds of soil, and the steel framing. I steered us off the main path and into a service road choked with frozen brush. The ash was deep here, threatening to bog us down, but the dual-motor AWD system chewed through it, the torque-vectoring software shifting power between the wheels with precision no gas engine could ever match. I could feel the trailer swaying behind me, its high profile catching the crosswinds. I had to keep the speed under 5 miles per hour to avoid tipping over in the deep drifts. Every time the truck tilted, I held my breath, waiting for the sound of shattering plastic. The suspension groaned under combined weight, the shocks bottoming out over the hidden ruts in the road. We moved like a shadow. Every time a spotlight swept near us, I held my breath. I could hear the roar of their engines now, the sound of unrefined fuel being burned in old, tired cylinders. They were looking for something to kill. I was just trying to keep something alive. I guided the truck through a gap in the perimeter fence, the metal wires screeching against the side panels, and began the slow climb into the foothills. The trail was narrow and treacherous. I had to stop once to move a fallen cedar tree that was blocking the path. I didn't dare use the winch. The noise would carry for miles in the thin air. Instead, I used a snatch block in the truck's low-speed crawl torque to pull the log just enough to squeeze the trailer through. The wood snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and I froze, waiting for the spotlights to swing our way. But the wind was our friend. It carried the sound away, burying it in the general roar of the storm. Once we reached a high, rocky outcrop that blocked the view from the valley, I finally allowed myself to stop. I looked back down. The gas guzzlers were at the greenhouse now, their spotlights dancing over the spot where I had been working only 20 minutes prior. They were circling the irrigation pond, their beams reflecting off the frozen water. They had missed us by a hair's breadth. I turned my back on them and looked at the battery monitor. 12% left. The drive and the mechanical work had drained the pack faster than the turbine could replenish it while moving. I reached for the switch I'd installed on the dash, the one labeled arc. I flipped it. Through the rear view mirror, I saw a faint, ethereal glow begin to emanate from the trailer. It started as a dim amber and then transitioned into a brilliant daylight white light as the LEDs reached full power. Through the translucent polycarbonate and the gaps in the mylar, the trailer looked like a fallen star sitting in the middle of a dead forest. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I climbed out and walked to the back, peeling back a small corner of the thermal blankets I draped over the exterior. Inside, the air was already beginning to warm. The soil was steaming. In the center of the trailer, I had planted a single tray of microgreens, the fastest growing seeds I had. They were tiny, fragile specks of green in a world of gray. I touched the soil, feeling the warmth radiating from the heating tape below. It was a miracle of engineering and desperation. I spent the next hour meticulously checking the seals on the polycarbonate panels, duct taping any gaps where the warmth could leak out. The wind was relentless up here, but the turbine was humming a high, steady pitch that meant we were finally gaining ground on the battery drain. I moved back into the cab, feeling the heat from the dashboard vents begin to thaw my frozen boots. I looked out into the absolute blackness of the valley below. Somewhere down there, people were fighting over scraps of blankets and the last few gallons of fuel. They were burning the past to survive the present. Up here, under the shelter of the granite ridge, the white light of the arc reflected off the frozen trees, creating a small, artificial sanctuary of light. I wasn't burning the past. I was trying to grow the future. The dogs settled beside me, their breathing steady and rhythmic. Bear's head was heavy on my lap, his fur smelling of wood smoke and wet ash. I leaned my head back against the headrest, the rhythmic thrum of the turbine overhead finally pulling me into a shallow, guarded sleep. The world was still cold, The night was still long, and the enemies were still out there. But for the first time in a year, I had a garden. And in a world of ash, that was everything. I sat there for what felt like hours, just watching the way the white light from the trailer caught the falling ash, turning the toxic debris into something that looked like diamonds. I thought about the mountain lion and the men in the trucks, and the millions of people who hadn't made it this far. I wasn't special. I just had a truck, a trailer, and a stubborn refusal to die in the dark. I adjusted the battery management system to prioritize the Ark's thermal loops over the truck's cabin heater. I could wear more blankets. The plants couldn't. I watched the numbers on the screen slowly climb. 13%, 14%, 15%. Each percentage point was a victory, a tiny buffer against the entropy of the world. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of the impact. I dreamt of a single green leaf pushing to the dirt, reaching for a sun that wasn't there yet. The ascent toward the high ridge was a slow-motion war against a world that had forgotten the color of the sky. With the trailer hooked up, the truck's center of gravity had shifted back and up, making every incline feel like a gamble against the laws of physics. I kept my eyes locked on the dual-motor torque display, watching the digital representation of the power split. The rear motor was pulling 60% of the load, the cooling fan screaming as they tried to dump the heat generated by the massive amperage draw required to move 3 tons of dead weight through 2 feet of uncompacted volcanic soot. The road was a narrow shelf of shattered asphalt and deep, treacherous ash drifts that had boulders and frost heaves. One wrong move, one patch of ice hidden under the soot, and the weight of the Ark would drag the truck sideways into the ravine. I was entirely alone in the cab, the only sounds being the mechanical whine of the drivetrain and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the dogs. Bear was jammed into the space behind the seats. His chin rested on my shoulder, while Echo was braced against the passenger door, her eyes fixed on the swirling gray void outside. I found myself talking to them just to break the oppressive tension of the climb. I told them about the ridge, about the granite overhang I'd scouted months ago, and how the wind-up that would finally give us the power we needed to keep the lights on. They didn't understand the physics of wind loading or the chemistry of nutrient solutions, but they understood the tone of my voice. They knew we were running from something, even if they couldn't smell the diesel of the gas guzzlers through the truck's charcoal filters. The higher we climbed, the thinner the air became, and the more the sulfurous scent of the volcanic vents began to seep through the seals. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed with steel wool. Every few miles, I had to stop and get out to check the hitch and the structural integrity of the polycarbonate box. I stood in the biting wind, my headlamp cutting a weak yellow path through the falling ash, and tightened the grade 8 bolts until my knuckles turned white. The cold was a physical presence now, a sharp blade that found every gap in my layers, creeping into my boots and leaching the heat from my joints. The ash was so fine that it found its way into the threads of the bolts, making every adjustment a grinding, screeching ordeal. By the time we reached the 1,400-foot mark, the violet twilight was fading into the absolute, terrifying black of the long night. I had to switch to the infrared HUD. The world on the screen was a ghost map of cold blues and deep purples. I saw the heat signatures of the mountain itself, faint thermal bleeds from deep fissures, but nothing else. No trees, no birds, no life. Just a vertical desert of stone and soot. The truck's battery was down to 9% when the nose of the vehicle finally leveled out onto the granite shelf. I didn't cheer. I didn't have the energy left for emotion. I just eased the rig into the deepest part of the notch, tucked tight against a wall of solid rock that soared 300 feet straight up into the darkness. This was a spot. It was a natural fortress, protected from the worst of the valley winds, but positioned right in the throat of a mountain pass, where the air current was constant and predictable. I killed the motors and sat there for a moment in the sudden, jarring silence. My hands were cramped into the permanent shape of the steering wheel, and my legs were shaking from the constant minute modulation of the pedals. We were here, but being here was only half the battle. If I didn't get the turbine up and the arc stabilized within the hour, the drop in temperature would kill the sprouts before they even had a chance to breathe. I stepped out into the gale, and the wind nearly took the door off its hinges. The wind on the ridge wasn't like the wind in the valley. It was a physical force, a wall of moving air that tried to shove me off the ledge and into the abyss. I had to use a safety line, clipping my climbing harness to the truck's roof rack before I even attempted to move toward the trailer. The ash was horizontal here, a blinding sleet of gray that coated my goggles in seconds, forcing me to wipe them every 30 seconds just to see my own hands. I worked by touch, my fingers numb despite the heavy industrial work gloves I'd layered over silk liners. First came the anchors. I couldn't trust the truck's weight alone to keep us on the shelf in a gale of this magnitude. I used a hammer drill, spending the precious last bits of the main battery, to sink 3-inch expansion bolts into the granite. The sound of the drill was swallowed instantly by the wind, but I could feel the vibration through my boots. I threaded heavy-duty steel cables through the bolts and winched the truck's frame down until the suspension was fully compressed. We were part of the mountain now, a 3-ton barnacle clinging to a dead reef. Then came the turbine. I had to climb onto the roof of the truck to clear the ice that had formed on the hub during the climb. The wind tried to peel me off the metal, whipping my parka around my waist and threatening to toss me into the black void. I used a spray bottle of high-concentration isopropyl alcohol to melt the frozen ash out of the bearings, watching the gray slush run down the windshield. As soon as the blades were free, the turbine let out a low, rising hum that quickly escalated into a roar. I looked down through the windshield at the dash. Charging, 3.8 kilowatts. It was a flood of power, a torrent of electrons pouring back into the depleted cells. The battery icon on the screen began to pulse, a tiny green heartbeat in the dark. With the power stabilized, I turned my attention to the arc. The polycarbonate panels were holding, but the internal temperature was already down to 45 degrees, a dangerous threshold for the tropical origin seeds I was trying to cheat into life. I scrambled into the back of the trailer, the mylar walls crinkling like thunder around me as the wind buffeted the exterior. The air inside was stale and cold, but the plants were still there, tiny shadows in the dimness. I hit the manual override for the heating tapes, and I could almost hear the soil sigh as the warmth began to seep through the trays. I knelt in the narrow aisle between the racks, my headlamp illuminating the tiny green stems of the radishes. They looked so fragile, so impossibly out of place in this jagged, frozen world. I found myself reaching out to touch one, then pulling back, terrified that the cold radiating from my own body might wither it. I checked the nutrient reservoir. It hadn't frozen, but it was close. I activated the circulation pump, watching the dark, mineral-rich water begin to pulse through the lines. I spent the next several hours mummifying the trailer. I had rolls of closed cell foam insulation and more thermal blankets. I wrapped the exterior of the polycarbonate in a thick, silver skin, duct taping the seams until the arc looked like a massive, metallic chrysalis. I was exhausted, my movements becoming slow and sloppy, but I couldn't stop. Every gap I left was a thermal leak that would cost me precious watts. The tape wouldn't stick to the frost-covered plastic, so I had to use a heat gun to dry the surfaces inch by inch, a tedious process that felt like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. When I finally finished, I crawled back into the cab of the truck, moving like an old man. Bear and Echo were waiting, their heads cocked as they watched me struggle to pull my boots off. I stripped off my outer layers, which were caked in a half-inch of frozen ashen grit, and threw them into the footwell. I turned on the cab heater, a luxury I could finally afford with the turbine screaming overhead, and felt the feeling start to return to my toes. It was a painful, pins and needles sensation that made me hiss through my teeth and bury my face in my hands. I pulled out my logbook. My handwriting was a jagged mess, my fingers still refusing to cooperate fully with the pen. I recorded the battery levels, the wind speed, and the internal temperature of the Arkansas. I felt like a captain of a ship that had been grounded on a reef, but we were still afloat. We were still technically moving forward, even if we were stationary. I noted the time, 0400 hours. The long night still had 10 hours to go before the violet light returned. As the night deepened, the wind intensified, funneling to the pass with predatory intent. The turbine's hum turned into a high-pitched scream, a mechanical wail that vibrated through the truck's frame and into my very marrow. I checked the overspeed sensors on the tablet, but the washing machine motor was holding steady, the magnetic braking system dumping the excess energy into a resistive heating element I'd submerged in the trailer's water tank. We weren't just charging the batteries anymore. We were using the storm to create a thermal reservoir. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the cab was broken only by the whistling of the wind through the door seals. I kept thinking about the tracks I'd seen back at the greenhouse, the mountain lion. Up here, on this narrow shelf, there were no tracks, but there were shadows. Every time the truck rocked in a particularly violent gust, I imagined a shape moving just beyond the reach of the infrared. A starving, yellow-eyed ghost waiting for me to fail. I knew the gas guzzlers wouldn't find us tonight. Their heavy, internal combustion rigs would have stalled out or slid off the trail miles ago. But the mountain itself felt alive, and it didn't want us here. I reached out and touched the dash screen, toggling the view to the interior of the Arkansas. The white light was blinding on the small display, a stark contrast to the oppressive blackness of cab. I watched the plants for a long time, mesmerized by the stillness of them. They were the only things in my world that weren't moving, weren't fighting, weren't dying. They were just existing, converting my labor and the mountain's fury into oxygen and fiber. It was a ridiculous, beautiful trade. I found a stash of old protein bars in the center console and shared one with the dogs. It tasted like cardboard and chemicals, but it was fuel. Everything was fuel now. The wind, the battery, the soil, the dog's body heat. It was all part of a single, closed-loop equation for survival. I calculated the caloric density of the radish sprouts versus the energy I was spending to grow them. It was a losing game, mathematically speaking. I was spending thousands of watt-hours to produce a handful of leaves. But you can't eat electricity, and you can't build a future out of lead-acid batteries. I adjusted the light cycle, extending the day for the plants by another 2 hours. With the turbine providing a steady 4 kilowatts, I could afford to push them. I wanted them to grow fast enough that I could see the progress with my own eyes. I needed that visual proof that life was still possible. I watched the humidity sensor in the trailer climb to 60%. The plants were transpiring, breathing moisture into the air. In the middle of a world that was drying out and turning to dust, I had created a humid, tropical pocket of air. I checked the perimeter sensors one last time. The motion detectors were silent, but the thermal camera picked up a faint signature near the base of the ridge. Likely a coyote or a desperate scavenger, but it was miles away and moving in the opposite direction. We were isolated, but for the first time, that isolation felt like a shield rather than a prison. I found myself thinking about the greenhouse owner. Had he known what he was leaving behind? Had he imagined someone like me, huddled in a truck on a mountain ledge, using his irrigation trays to keep the world from ending? Probably not. He probably just wanted to grow flowers for people who didn't have to worry about the sky falling. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the simplicity of that old world, a world where green was a color, not a survival strategy. "We're okay?" I whispered to the dogs, my voice sounding strange in the small space. Echo let out a low, huffing sound and rested her chin on my knee, her warm breath seeping through my jeans. Bear was already snoring, his massive body a source of heat that I leaned into. I watched the charging rate climb as the storm peaked. For 0.2 kilowatts. For 0.5, the battery was already back up to 30%. By morning, or the violet approximation of morning, we would be at full capacity, our tanks brimming with the mountain's energy. I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of a single green leaf pushing through the dirt, reaching for a sun that wasn't there yet. I dreamed of the quarry Silas had mentioned, visualizing the maintenance tunnels as a permanent home for the Arkansas. I saw the truck parked in the dark, the white light of the trailer reflecting off limestone walls. And for the first time in a year, the dream wasn't a nightmare. It was a blueprint. The wind continued to shake the truck, and the turbine roared its defiance into the black sky. But inside the cab, it was warm. The lights were on. The soil was damp. I let the vibration of the motors lull me into a dreamless void, while outside, the ash continued to fall, burying the ruins of civilization in a silent, gray shroud that couldn't touch the little star I'd anchored to the granite peak. We were a flicker of light in a dead universe. And for tonight, that was enough. The silence of the quarry was heavier than the roar of the wind had ever been. It was a dense, pressurized quiet that made my ears ring, the kind of stillness that only exists deep underground where the atmosphere is measured in tons of rock rather than barometric pressure. After I secured the massive steel doors of the maintenance bay, I didn't just collapse. The adrenaline from the roadblock was still humming in my veins like a live wire, making my vision pulse in time with the distant muffled thrum of the wind turbine above. I spent the first hour in the cave doing a frantic, hands-on assessment of the rig by the light of a handheld lantern. The front bumper was twisted where I clipped the bus. The reinforced steel pulled away from the frame like a peeled orange. A long, jagged scratch ran the length of the Ark's polycarbonate siding where a frozen branch or a piece of flying debris had tried to claw its way in during the descent from the high ridge. I grabbed a roll of heavy-duty bitumen tape and began sealing every hairline fracture in the trailer's hull. In this cave, humidity was going to be my new enemy. If the moisture from the soil escaped and condensed on the limestone walls, it would create a damp microclimate that would breed mold in a week, ruining the electronics and the crop. I had to turn the Ark into a perfectly closed-loop ecosystem. I worked in the gloom, using only the spillover light from the grow trays to see what I was doing. The dogs were restless, their paws clicking on the stone floor as they explored the perimeter of the maintenance bay, sniffing at rusted lockers and old crates of drilling equipment. Every time a pebble shifted or a drop of water hit a metal surface, Bear would let out a low, vibrating growl that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I found a stack of wooden pallets in the corner and began breaking them down with a pry bar, the sound of splintering would echoing like gunshots in the confined space. I needed a staging area. I couldn't keep living out of a cab if I was going to turn this quarry into a permanent base. I built a raised platform next to the trailer, giving myself a dry place to sort seeds and maintain the hardware. My hands were shaking, a combination of the lingering cold and the physical come down from the chase, but the repetitive motion of the work helped ground me. I felt like a carpenter building a pier on a dead island. I used the leftover wood to build a small workbench where I could lay out my tools and the spare parts I'd scavenged from the greenhouse. I spent a long time organizing my wrenches, drivers, and electrical testers, finding comfort in the order of the tools when the world outside was in total chaos. Once the platform was up, I turned my attention back to the power problem. The chimney effect from the ventilation shaft was working, but it was weak compared to the gale on the ridge. The turbine was spinning, but the display only showed a measly 200 watt intake. That wouldn't even cover the circulation fans, let alone the high-intensity grow lights. I needed a better solution, and I needed it before the truck's pack hit the critical floor. I began a systematic search of the quarry's annexes, my headlamp cutting through layers of dust that had settled over years of neglect. The air back here was stagnant and tasted of ancient limestone and machine oil. In the back of the bay, tucked under a rotted, oil-soaked tarp that smelled of old diesel and decay, I hit the jackpot. A series of heavy-duty lead-acid batteries from an old industrial forklift and a pallet of solar panels that had never been installed. The panels were useless for their intended purpose. There hadn't been direct sunlight in over a year, but the frames and the wiring were pure gold. I spent hours stripping the copper and bypass diodes, my fingers turning black with grease, oxidation, and old hydraulic fluid. I felt like a surgeon operating on a ghost. Each battery weighed nearly 100 pounds, and moving them onto my makeshift platform was a brutal, back-breaking process. I had to use a crowbar and a series of rollers made from old pipes to inch them into position. I spent the next day wiring the forklift batteries into a secondary storage bank. I wasn't just relying on the truck anymore. I was building a microgrid. I hauled the solar panels up to the surface through the narrow ventilation shaft, dragging them up a rusted ladder one rung at a time. I didn't lay them flat. I angled them toward the southern horizon to catch every possible photon of the dim, ambient violet light that filtered through the thick ash clouds. It was a long shot, but even a few milliamps were better than nothing. I had to secure them with heavy rocks to keep the wind from turning them into jagged sails. Back in the cave, the environment was slowly changing. The heat radiating from the ark was starting to take the edge off the limestone's chill, raising the ambient temperature of the bay to a bearable 50 degrees. I opened the trailer door and let the dogs climb inside for a few minutes. Bear laid his head on the rim of a radish tray, sniffing the green leaves with a look of genuine confusion. To him, the world had been gray and dead for his entire adult life. This scent, this sharp, peppery smell of living things, was a ghost from a past he didn't remember. I watched him, wondering if he could sense the life in the plants the same way he could sense a predator in the dark. I decided it was time to expand the crop. I had a cache of heirloom kale and spinach seeds I'd been saving for a moment of true stability. I prepped 3 more trays, mixing the nutrient solution by the light of a single headlamp. My water supply was the primary bottleneck. I had 50 gallons in the truck's auxiliary tank, but that wouldn't last forever. I found a slow, steady drip coming from a crack in the cave ceiling, groundwater filtering through hundreds of feet of limestone. I set up a collection bucket and a portable filtration kit, listening to the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of the water hitting the plastic. It was the sound of a clock resetting, a slow heartbeat for our new home. I measured the flow rate. It was barely a gallon an hour, but over a day, it would be enough to keep the hydroponics topped off. By the 3rd day in the quarry, I was starting to lose track of the world outside. The blackout monitor remained quiet, the thermal cameras showing nothing but the occasional swirl of ash at the quarry entrance. But the isolation was starting to grate on my nerves. I found myself talking to the dogs more than usual, explaining the chemistry of nitrogen cycles or the mechanics of the truck's inverter just to hear the sound of a human voice. The silence of the cave was a physical weight, a pressure that made me feel like I was buried alive. I began to keep a detailed journal, not just the technical data, but my own thoughts, try to anchor my mind to something other than the gray horizon. I spent a few hours exploring the deeper tunnels of the quarry. It went back hundreds of yards, a labyrinth of carved stone and abandoned machinery. I found an old foreman's office that still had a calendar on the wall from the year of the impact. The red circles around long past deadlines, and birthdays felt like artifacts from an alien civilization. I scavenged a desk and a chair, dragging them back to my camp by the ark. I needed a place to sit that wasn't a truck seat. I needed to feel like a person again, not just a survivor. I set up a small library with the few books I'd saved, creating a tiny pocket of culture in a world of stone. On the 5th night, the alarm on the perimeter sensor finally tripped. I was awake in an instant, my hand closing around the heavy iron pipe I kept next to my sleeping bag. Bear was already at the bay door, his hackles up and his body low to the ground. There was a low vibration in his chest that I could feel through the stone floor before I could even hear it. I checked the monitor on the dash. 3 figures were standing at the quarry gate. They weren't the gas guzzlers. They didn't have the armored trucks or the spotlights. They were thin, moving with a jerky, exhausted gait that suggested advanced starvation. They weren't armed with rifles. They had makeshift spears and a single rusted hatchet. They looked like they had been hollowed out by the world. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for the heat. Even through the thick steel doors and the limestone, the thermal signature of the Ark was leaking out through the ventilation shaft, a tiny plume of warmth rising into frozen air like a signal fire. I watched them on the screen for a long time, my heart thumping against my ribs. They huddled together near the entrance, trying to shield themselves from the wind. One of them collapsed into the ash, and the other 2 struggled to pull him back up, their movements slow and weak. They were dying right in front of me, only 20 feet of steel and stone away. I looked at my trays of microgreens. They were almost ready for a first harvest. I had enough to supplement my own rations for a few weeks, but not enough to feed a village. If I opened that door, I was inviting the world's bottomless hunger into my sanctuary. If I stayed silent, I was just a man growing a garden in a tomb. I thought about the greenhouse and the owner who had left his life's work behind. He hadn't built it to be a fortress. He'd built it to be a source. But the world had changed, and the rules of mercy had been rewritten in ash. The weight of the decision felt heavier than the mountain above me. I didn't open the door. I couldn't risk the dogs or the Arkansas. I watched them until they eventually turned away, drifting back into gray fog of the valley like ghosts returning to a graveyard. The guilt was a cold, sharp weight in my gut, heavier than the hunger I felt every morning. I went back to the Ark and sat among the plants, the white light feeling colder and more clinical than it had the day before. I realized then that the Ark wasn't just a survival tool. It was a burden. As long as I had it, I had something to lose. I had a reason to be afraid of my fellow man. I spent the rest of the night checking the battery levels and the light timers, my movements robotic and hollow. The turbine was humming. The forklift batteries were holding a charge, and the kale was starting to sprout, tiny curled leaves of dark green pushing through the soil. Everything was working perfectly. The system was stable. But the silence of the cave felt different now. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a hiding place. I looked at the dogs, who had settled back down after the intruders left. They didn't judge me for keeping the door closed. They just waited for the next command, their loyalty as unwavering as the stone around us. I felt like a coward and a king and a ghost all at once. I spent the next few days reinforcing the entrance. I found old blasting mats, heavy blankets made of woven steel cable, and draped them over the inner bay doors to provide an extra layer of ballistic protection and thermal insulation. I moved the truck further into the tunnel, hiding it behind a massive limestone pillar. I was becoming a ghost, disappearing further into the earth with every passing hour. I started to map the ventilation shafts, looking for secondary exits and potential ambush points. I wasn't just a gardener anymore. I was a commander of a very small, very lonely outpost. I set up tripwires made of thin fishing line and old bells I'd found in the office, creating a low-tech alarm system that didn't rely on the battery. I also began to experiment with the nutrient levels in the water. Without the sun, the plants were entirely dependent on the chemical cocktail I provided. I found that increasing the iron and magnesium slightly helped the kale maintain its color under the artificial lights. I was learning the language of the leaves, interpreting every yellow edge or drooping stem as a message from a world I was trying to save. I spent hours just watching the water move through the clear tubes of the hydroponic system, the bubbles of oxygen providing a rhythmic, hypnotic soundtrack to my isolation. I found that the sound of the pumps helped me sleep, a mechanical heartbeat that replaced the silence of the void. One afternoon, I found a cache of old maps in the foreman's office. They showed a series of natural caverns that connected to the quarry's lower levels. According to the notes, these caverns were part of an underground river system that had been dry for decades. If I could reach them, I might find a more reliable source of water and perhaps even a way to tap into geothermal heat. The idea was intoxicating, a way to expand the ark without increasing the strain on the surface turbine. I spent the next 2 days clearing rubble from the access shaft, my back aching from the manual labor. It was a slow, grueling task, moving rocks by hand and winching them up with the truck's motor. As I worked, I thought about the world above. The gas guzzlers were still out there, burning the last of the world's resources to maintain a fleeting sense of power. They were predators in a world that was running out of prey. Down here, in the dark, I was something else. I was a producer. I was creating calories from thin air and stone. It felt like a holy mission, a quiet rebellion against the entropy of the impact. I realized that my survival wasn't just about me. It was about the seeds. If I died, the knowledge of how to grow these specific plants in these specific conditions might die with me. I began to laminate my notes using clear tape and plastic sheets, making sure they would survive even if the cave flooded. I started to write down everything. I created a manual for the ark, detailing the wiring, the nutrient ratios, and the light cycles. I wrote it on the back of old quarry invoices and shipping manifests, using a charcoal pencil-eyed fashion from a burnt cedar branch. I wanted there to be a record. If someone else found this cave after I was gone, I wanted them to know how to keep the light on. I wanted them to know that for a few years, at least, someone had kept the green alive. I wrote about the dogs, too, and the way the mountain lion looked in the purple twilight. I wanted the record to be more than just technical. I wanted it to be human. The dogs seemed to settle into the routine of the cave. They no longer paced the perimeter with the same nervous energy. They had found their favorite spots, Echo near the warmth of the trailer, and Bear by the main door, always listening. We were a pack, a small unit of life in a vast expanse of death. We ate together, slept together, and watched the plants grow together. It was a simple, brutal existence, stripped of all the distractions of the old world. I found that I no longer missed the things I thought I would. I didn't miss the internet or the news or the noise of city. I missed the smell of rain on hot pavement. I missed the sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. I missed things that required a sun to exist. One night, I sat on my pallet platform and opened a can of peaches I'd been saving for a special occasion. I shared the fruit with the dogs. The sweet, syrupy taste, a shocking contrast to the dry rations we've been living on. It felt like a celebration, though I wasn't sure of what. Maybe I was celebrating the fact that the battery was at 90%. Maybe I was celebrating the first harvest of radishes. Or maybe I was just celebrating the fact that the sky hadn't finished us off yet. I looked at the radish in my hand. It was small, slightly misshapen, but it was bright red and firm. I took a bite. It was spicy, crunchy, and tasted like life. I closed my eyes, savoring the flavor, and for a moment, the walls of the quarry disappeared. I was back in the sun, in a world where food grew everywhere, and you didn't have to hide in a hole to stay warm. When I opened my eyes, the white light of the ark was still there, and the limestone walls were still cold, but the taste of the radish remained. It was real. It was possible. I stayed there until the violet twilight returned to world above, watching the way the plants reached for the artificial sun. I had survived the ridge, the roadblock, and the cold. I had found a fortress. I had everything I needed to stay alive for a long time. The world was still dead and I was still alone, but in the heart of the mountain, the garden was still growing. I checked the sensors one last time, adjusted the water drip, and laid down to sleep. The steady, electric hum of the life I was protecting was the last thing I heard before the darkness took me. I knew that tomorrow would be gray, and the day after that. But for now, the light was winning. This was where the road ended, not in a city or a camp, but here in the ribs of the earth. I realized that I didn't need to find a colony or sanctuary. I had built one. The Ark was no longer a trailer. It was the world. I was no longer a scavenger. I was a steward. I lay back on my sleeping bag, looking up at the dark stone ceiling. Somewhere far above, the ash was falling on a dead planet. But down here, a single green leaf was reaching for the light. It was enough. The story of the end of the world was over, and the story of the garden had begun. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the quarry take me, a quiet, peaceful darkness that didn't feel like death at all. It felt like a beginning.